Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the MRC Public Partnerships team. We are delighted that you could join us to explore public involvement and engagement in non-clinical research. And we have three speakers who will share their experiences of funding, delivering and partnering in this work. My name is Lisa Jamieson and I have very recently joined MRC as Programme Director for Public Partnerships. Prior to this, I was working freelance across higher education and research sectors, and prior to that, in a variety of public engagement roles at Wellcome. The MRC's new public partnership strategy was launched in July 2024 after an 18-month co-development process with Vocal and an external advisory group. It's an initial 3-year strategy as part of a longer-term ambition to integrate public partnerships across MRC business. By public partnerships, we mean all the different ways that people and the research community can come together to shape and share scientific research. It covers the whole spectrum of public engagement, from informing and inspiring to involvement and community engagement, and across all parts of the MRC research portfolio. Mine is a new role to provide leadership, advocacy and visibility to the programme of work, and I'll be working across the MRC research community, the wider biomedical research community, and within MRC and UKRI head office too. We're working hard, implementing and evaluating the strategy as it is, and I'm also considering how best to establish expertise and resource to sustain public partnerships for the long term. My immediate priorities are to get to know the MRC community and the incredible research we're enabling, to understand your needs and ambitions when it comes to public partnerships, and to celebrate and share success through events like this. And of course, we're not working alone, but are working in close partnership with others across the research and innovation system. Our public partnership strategy applies to all of the research that MRC supports, and we're particularly excited by the potential of public partnerships in the non-clinical research space to bring benefits to research and to society, which I suppose is a neat segue into the topic of today's webinar. So without further ado, let's take a look at the programme that's ahead for the next hour or so. First up, we'll hear from Rosalind Roberts, the Programme Manager at the MRC, and Munisa Hashimi, one of our public partners, on understanding public involvement in non-clinical research through the MRC NIHR Better Methods, Better Research funding call. Then it will be over to Peter Rugg Gunn, a Senior Group Leader at the Babraham Institute and also Head of Public Engagement there, to share with us how they engage and involve the public in developmental biology research. Now, without further ado, over to our first speaker, Rosalind Roberts.
So thanks everyone. I'm here with Munisa Hashimi, who's the chair of the Public Involvement Methods Advisory Group that we set up to co-develop the call on public involvement in non-clinical research. And you'll hear a bit more about that later. My name is Rosalind Roberts. I'm a programme manager at MRC with responsibility for methodology research, and I was the lead for Better Methods, Better Research when we were developing and running this call. The scheme is now managed by NIHR, so if you're interested in applying in the future, please take a look at the NIHR web pages. But for now, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview to the scheme and what led to us developing this call, and then Munisa will provide her perspective on the process. So Better Methods, Better Research is a co-funded programme between MRC and NIHR, and the aim of the scheme is to support generalisable research method development and also the implementation and uptake of those methods right across MRC and NIHR remit, and all the way from experimental design through to analysis, evaluation, and ultimately dissemination and uptake of the methods. And what we're trying to achieve by getting the research community to have better methods and also use those better methods is to make sure that health and biomedical research is conducted in a rigorous and reproducible way, and that is ultimately providing good value for money through efficiency and impact for the public. So through the programme, we've previously supported projects that have looked at public involvement and how it can best be conducted. All the way back almost 15 years ago, we supported a team led by Jenny Papay in Lancaster with the development of PIAF, which is a framework for understanding the impact of public involvement and providing a framework for how that impact can be assessed. More recently, we've supported Kerry Woolfall in Liverpool to explore how patient and public perspectives can impact the processes of recruitment and consent in cluster randomised trials involving children. And we've also supported Beatrice Gulau in Aberdeen, who has a really interesting project on how patients and public can be involved in determining target differences in clinical trials. And this is alongside a body of work that she's done to understand how patients and publics can be involved in determining numerical aspects of clinical trials. So we have a kind of basis of supporting public involvement research, but what we came to understand more recently was that there was a bit of a gap in how public involvement was being conducted in non-clinical research. Obviously, mostly clinical researchers are really familiar with public involvement and it's kind of become bread and butter. It's day-to-day practice for them and it's fundamental to all NIHR research grant applications. But at MRC, we're kind of catching up a little bit and also in the fundamental community. So we really wanted to address this gap and understand what approaches could be used to support public involvement in non-clinical research. And just to kind of define the key terms here, by public involvement, what we're meaning is that teams of researchers and members of the public and more broadly patients and community groups work alongside each other to deliver research, to design research. So it's really an equal partnership involving public in its broadest sense in research. By non-clinical biomedical and health research, what we're referring to here is essentially fundamental discovery research. So that can be all the way from lab-based research through to data science or methodology research. And in response to this call, we received a really broad range of applications addressing these areas. So in developing this funding opportunity, what we wanted to do was to ask researchers to develop supporting evidence, tools or guidance that would mean that public involvement practice in these non-clinical research areas could be improved, building consensus about what the best way to go about this was. And as I mentioned earlier, we did this together with a Public Involvement Methods Advisory Group, which Munisa was the chair of, and she'll give you a bit more detail about how that worked in a minute. And this group co-developed the call with MRC office, but they also were involved in the review process of the applications alongside the BNBR panel. And it's also worth mentioning that our identification of this gap really fitted well with the findings of the MRC Public Involvement Landscape Review and its recommendations and the ongoing work and commitments of the MRC Public Partnership Strategy. So I'm going to hand over to Munisa now, who's going to give you some of her perspectives.
Thank you so much, Rosie. Hello, everyone. My name is Munisa, and I had the pleasure of chairing the Public Involvement Methods Advisory Group, which we call PMAG. To provide a little bit of background on myself and my public involvement journey. My public involvement journey and PhD journey really started in parallel with one another, which I think is a bit unique. So I was able to bring my patient experience forward to discussions whilst also starting my journey in health data research. I was then given that sort of opportunity to have a dual perspective on learnings. So I was able to get involved in discussions, but also be learning as a PhD student about topics like trusted research environments and data security. The article that's shown on the screen at the moment is actually on the MRC Good Resources Hub, and it essentially just details some of the work that I've been able to do with the Health Data Research UK Public Advisory Board, some of the amazing projects that I've been involved in, and the amazing work of PAB and the impacts that the Public Advisory Board have had there. If anyone is interested in having a bit of a read. Could I have the next slide, please? So this slide is really just highlighting the application process, but also the core development process. For me, this was actually my first time getting involved in a review process like this. And PMAG in itself was actually a very new experience for me, as it actually comprised of both public partners and PPA professionals. And I really think having that blended voice between the two groups really brought a lot to the process. The process as a whole can actually be split into 3 different areas. The first area was actually the co-development of the funding opportunity. PMAG here had a really big input into the funding call as a whole. We were able to give advice on defining areas of need, the language used in the call text, but also the overall assessment criteria. The review process, we split it into 2 sections here where PMAG were able to get involved. The first was the shortlisting stage. So all PMAG members had 5 to 10 applications to review, and these were in a prioritization exercise. So each PMAG member from those applications selected 2 that they felt were really strong and should be prioritized for the next round. Myself and the deputy chair then represented these prioritizations at the prioritization shortlisting meeting. And I have to say PMAG's prioritization and overall thoughts on the applications were really taken into consideration at the shortlisting meeting and really valued at that meeting. We then move on to the funding meeting, which was an all-day meeting. All PMAG members attended, and whether that was in person or online. And this followed the usual MRC review process. So we were each given from those shortlist applications a few to essentially represent, provide the strengths and weaknesses for. And I have to say at that meeting, I did feel that PMAG's comments were fundamental to essentially the ones that were inevitably funded, and also for the comprehensive feedback which were provided to the applicants after. Next slide, please. Thank you. So these are some of my reflections on the process. So I split my reflections into 2 sections, one on the overall development of the funding call and the second on the review process. For the development of the funding call, it was very evident from the get-go that this was a very important area that we were looking at funding, and it was often an overlooked area of not only public involvement and engagement, but in terms of the research that we were looking at, which was the non-clinical areas. I have to say that PMAG played a key role in shaping the scope and criteria for the call, and one of the key ways that I felt that that was done was through making sure that it really was impacting real-world priorities. The experience demonstrated the value of embedding public voices from the sort of inception of a project. So we weren't just sort of called in just to review the applications, but we're actually there to ensure that, for example, the assessment criteria were to the standards of PMAG. We then had the review process, and my reflections on this was that it's definitely a complex process, but it definitely had value in having public contributors and PPA professionals involved, and having us there to ensure that the decisions that were being made were to those real world priorities. It was definitely a significant time commitment, but I think having that public voice and the PPA professionals' voice was incredibly worthwhile to the process. As a whole, I think having public contributors really strengthened the review process and the transparency and relevancy of that, but also ensured that the projects that were being funded were very impactful. And those are my reflections. So I'll hand back over to Rosie.
Thanks, Munisa. I think, yeah, from our perspective, it was really valuable to have PMAG involved in the process. And I think having that input meant that the call was fit for purpose, and really enriched the development of the call. I think also backing up Munisa's point that it was an area that was underfunded and overlooked, we did receive a significant number of applications. So we received 69 applications, whereas usually for BMBR we receive around 30. So there's clearly appetite within the non-clinical community to do public involvement, to make sure that there are processes and learnings that can be taken forward across the community. So I think that's really exciting, and having PMAG involvement really enabled that. In terms of managing the review process, there is definitely a high workload and complexity, both for PMAG and BMBR, and also the office. And really, on reflection, a two-stage process with an expression of interest would have kind of eased that burden. I also think that having so many applications meant that we were a bit stretched for time when we came to the funding meeting. And I think actually, even though PMAG and BMBR worked really well together and really listened to each other, I think that having some extra time to put in some relationship building would have really strengthened that process as well. So that's something to take forward and moving forward. We really valued having the PMAG perspective and making sure that the portfolio we funded was impactful. And again, that, as Munisa said, having that feedback to give to applicants was really important. I think another thing that came out of having PMAG involved in the process was that there are sort of language differences between how the clinical research community, who might be very familiar with public involvement, and the fundamental researchers, how the type of language that's used might be unfamiliar to those fundamental researchers. And I think it was really important to have that voice fed in to the review process. Just really briefly, we funded 5 projects through this call, which are listed here, and which cover a wide variety of areas in non-clinical research, and even an app that will support public partners getting involved in research itself. These teams are working together. We had a kind of kick-off meeting for the teams a few months ago, and what really came out of that was that they're really keen to work together, especially to understand what's already out there and how they can build on existing resources, particularly how they can kind of build from the excellent public engagement practice, which many fundamental scientists, researchers are quite comfortable with, how that can be built on to shift into incorporating public involvement into their research processes as well. So I think it's a really exciting set of awards, and really looking forward to seeing what the outputs are from these, and the kind of overarching portfolio of guidance that comes out from those. So with that, just to thank everybody involved, and obviously all of the members of PMAG who were involved both in the co-development process and in the review process, the data science team, especially Ben, who supported in the early stages of this, the BMBR team who dealt with the high volume of applications we got, the public partnerships team for sharing their know-how as I was in the initial stages of this, and also the BMBR panel, especially the chair, Marion Campbell, and the deputy chair, Jane Noyes, for all their work in making sure that we had a good meeting with PMAG. So thank you very much.
I'm delighted to welcome our third speaker today, Peter Rugg, Senior Group Leader at the Babraham Institute, who will present on engaging and involving the public in human developmental biology research.
Hello, I'm Peter Rugg. I'm a scientist at the Babraham Institute in Cambridge. In today's webinar, I'm going to tell you about our research on human developmental biology and how we've been engaging and involving the public in our research. So in our research group, we're fascinated about how human embryos grow over the first few weeks of development. And the embryos undergo amazing transformations over this period. They turn from the single fertilized egg all the way up to an embryo that has form and structure several weeks later. And research into human development over these early phases has led to a lot of improvements in therapies. For instance, it's led to the establishment of IVF as a treatment for infertility. It's also helped to deliver new treatments for mitochondrial diseases. It's led to new knowledge about early miscarriage and the causes of this. And also the understanding of how the placenta is formed at this very early stage of development, which is crucial for establishing a healthy pregnancy. Currently, research in the UK can study human embryos cultured in vitro in the laboratory up to day 14 of development. And this is restricted in law by the so-called 14-day rule that we'll discuss towards the end of this webinar. Human embryos cannot be cultured in vitro beyond this 14 days. And as a consequence, very little is known actually about how human embryos develop beyond 14 days of development. And this is so-called the black box of human embryo development as a consequence. So in my research group, we study how human embryos develop around the 1 week and the 2 week mark. And this period coincides with when the embryo would normally implant into the lining of the uterus. It would also coincides with the appearance of major cell types in the embryo and the positioning and patterning of those cell types, and also the first development and appearance of these early placental cell types. And we are based at the Babraham Institute, which is a publicly funded research institute just south of Cambridge in this lovely green campus. And within this institute, we carry out a lot of public engagement work and have done so for many decades now. And our current public engagement strategy has 5 sections to it that I outline here. Firstly, we aim to promote researcher-led public engagement. So we provide a lot of training to our researchers and staff. We provide some seed funding to help support their sort of early stage projects in public engagement. As I'll mention a little bit more in a minute, we also have been working really hard these last few years to expand our audience reach, particularly into what have been traditionally underserved areas in terms of science capacity. We also have embedded public engagement widely at the Institute, and the public engagement program here helps support many of the other strategic initiatives here at the Institute. And of course, we are very outward looking. We engage widely with the public and members of society, different communities and stakeholders. And of course, embedded throughout all of this, we have evaluation looking at the impact of public engagement at the Babraham Institute on different audiences and also onto the research and the researchers. And you can find a copy of our current public engagement strategy on the Babraham Institute website. So just as one highlight of some of the work we've been doing recently at the Babraham Institute on our public engagement program, back in about 2020 or so, we decided to take very proactive steps in identifying and building relationships with communities that have been typically underserved by science engagement programs over the years. And so we've been using publicly available data in order to identify areas of these underserved communities that are mainly in East Anglia and in Cambridgeshire, and have been contacting some of the communities and schools in these geographic areas in order to build these relationships with them and help engage them in the sort of research that we're doing at the Babraham Institute. And the chart on the right hand side shows the percentage of the total audience engaged by the Babraham Institute who are from areas of high deprivation, and you can see Our sort of baseline going back a few years was under 5%. And then when we made this shift in audience targeting in 2020, you can now see that the percentage of audiences that we're targeting in our target groups are now increasing year on year and looking really very good. And we hope to continue this upward trend over the next few years. And researchers and other staff at the Institute report this as very rewarding, very engaging work. And we're certainly building up some really good relationships with communities and schools in these target areas. And as part of the research in my group, we are part of a bigger research consortium that's called the Human Developmental Biology Initiative, or the HDBI. And this is a consortium of 24 research groups from across the UK. It's a 6-year program funded by Wellcome. And the aim of this consortium is to better understand human development and the origins of various developmental conditions. And really importantly, alongside the research, there's embedded public engagement and ethics programs alongside this. And I think that's really important and has been one of the great successes of this HDBI consortium. So the public engagement program within the Human Developmental Biology Initiative has been led by Naomi Clements-Broad and Emma Rawlins, who are based at the University of Cambridge, and they've done some fantastic work with the public engagement program with this initiative. So some of the aims of the public engagement program here are to ensure that the research coming from this consortium on human development remains relevant to society, also to help generate and maintain trust in science, and also to improve the research itself through feedback, enhanced motivation of the researchers, and improving creativity and discussions, thinking of new ideas. And the way that this has been done is partly through what's called an insights group. This is a sort of public involvement group who are a group of members of the public who have had relationships with tissue donation as an example, and the researchers within the HDBI consortium spend time with the Insights group discussing their research and receiving views and opinion and feedback, etc. from the Insights group, and this has been extremely valuable process. There's been a lot of researcher training, which has been really popular at the consortium. There's been a really wide range of projects, both led by the consortium as well as by the individual institutes involved in this research. And there's also been a lot of evaluation throughout the course of this whole program. So in terms of the Insights group, Naomi and Emma recently published a really nice article on this called Adventures in Involving and Engaging the Public in Human Developmental Biology Research, and I provide the link to this article in the slide. And it's a really good article, contains a lot of information, and some of the benefits to researchers that have come out of the involvement of the Insights group have been, on one hand, quite practical. So this has led to improvements in patient information leaflets and resources, for instance. So receiving some really useful and very specific feedback on how to improve these documents. Also, from the researcher side of you, there's been improved awareness of sort of the big picture of what the researchers are working on. So this has really helped, I think, with that. And also better and greater awareness of public attitudes towards research. And finally, enhanced communication skills were also reported by most of the researchers involved in this. And so some of the advice for the researchers from members of the Insights group has included the following. So importantly, to consider your audience. That was very clearly defined to us. Explain early on why you are doing your research. That's really important too. The members of the Insights group also suggested that we signpost the audience to sources of further information, and also some really practical advice on how to choose words carefully. So for instance, instead of using the words normal or abnormal that researchers might often use, to just consider that language a bit and perhaps use words like typical or atypical instead. And so very useful practical information that the researchers can take on board. In thinking about relationships between society and research on the field of human developmental biology, this actually goes back really quite a long way, and there's been a very close relationship between science and society in terms of human embryo research. And so this, in the timeline that I show here on the slide, this goes back all the way to 1978, which was, of course, the first successful birth following in vitro fertilization. This was of Louise Brown. And then at the time, that instigated a lot of interest in this type of research. And this led to the founding of the Warnock Committee, who published their report in 1984, which set up recommendations for how human embryo research may be regulated. And then in turn, in 1990, this led to the founding of the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act, the HFE Act. And this is still the legislation that today regulates human embryo research. The Act was updated in 2008 to take into account new scientific developments. And then in 2010 up to 2014, there was a lot of public consultations on a new type of science technology that was becoming possible, and this was allowing mitochondrial donation therapies as a way to alleviate some very serious diseases that can be passed through certain mitochondria. And so there was a large public consultation on this, and in 2015 the UK Parliament then legalised mitochondrial donation therapies, and the Act was updated. And I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk that in UK law at the minute, human embryos can be cultured in vitro up to day 14. And the origins of this limitation, this 14-day rule, comes back to the 1990 HFE Act that I show here. And at the time in 1990, the 14-day limit was seen as quite a sort of a far off, still technically out of reach limit that human embryos could be developed in vitro up until this point. And then in 2016 there was two papers that showed that human embryos can be cultured in vitro up to day 14. And so it now, because it was now technically possible to grow human embryos up to this time point, that triggered a lot of interest, wide-ranging interest, I would say, in science and in society, about whether the 14-day limit was still appropriate, whether it was still the right one to have, whether attitudes were the same as they were back when the law was founded, or whether attitudes had changed, for example. But actually very little was known about what the public think about human embryo research, and also about the 14-day limit. And so as part of the HDBI public engagement program, we decided to hold a public dialogue on human embryo research and the 14-day rule, so that we could find out more information about what the public thinks about this type of research, and to hear their views and opinions on this topic. And so the public dialogue that we ran had several aims. Firstly, it was a qualitative study aimed at understanding participants' views on human developmental biology research, in order to better understand why were the views held, what was important to individuals, for example. And throughout the dialogue, there was a strong focus on the societal and the ethical issues, and identify the questions and outcomes of the research to better reflect and address social priorities. The public dialogue was commissioned and paid for by the Human Developmental Biology Initiative, together with ScienceWise, and the public dialogue ended up costing about £163,000 plus in-kind contributions from institutes involved in the project. And so in the next few slides, I'm going to describe this public dialogue in a little bit more detail. So in terms of methodology of the public dialogue, one of the key steps was formation of the oversight group. This consisted of 23 members with really diverse expertise, ranging from biologists to social scientists, ethicists, etc. And the goal of the oversight group is to help ensure that the methodology of the public dialogue was robust and it was appropriate. And they also helped coordinate the strategy for disseminating the report and the findings to wide audiences. In terms of the design and delivery of the public dialogue, there was a very experienced delivery and facilitation team involved. That was Hopkins Van Mill. And throughout the public engagement or the public dialogue process, there was input from 28 specialists, again, from a very wide range of specialties, not only biologists, but also a lot of ethicists, philosophers, social scientists, charities, regulators, etc. And at the same time, there was a small and very consistent core team from HDBI and from ScienceWise who really sort of worked closely to deliver this project. And throughout this, there was also independent evaluation from Ursus Consulting. My particular role was I was on the oversight group, and I was also part of the small core team from HDBI who helped to design and deliver this public dialogue project. In terms of methodology, maybe one slight difference with the approach here was that we used targeted recruitment of the public members so that we could obtain a range of levels of awareness of embryo research and regulation, as well as a mix of those who naturally supported or perhaps opposed this type of research. And also ensuring that the group was diverse, reflecting demographic characteristics and a range of religions and views, for example. In terms of implementation, this was carried out in 3 different phases. Phase 1 was a pilot study involving 9 participants so that we could see what was working or perhaps what needed tweaking. The second phase was working with people with lived experiences of topics to do with human developmental biology research. And this involved 21 participants in that part of the dialogue. And then the third phase was running the public dialogue with members of the general public. And so that was 42 participants. And throughout there was a mix of online and face-to-face workshops, the face-to-face workshops being held in Newcastle and in London. And so what were the main findings? Well, it was great fun. We all very much enjoyed taking part in this public dialogue. It was fascinating to hear all the conversations happening in the room. One of the take-home messages to us was that the public participants were really interested in hearing about human embryo research. They were really fascinated about the topic. Another is that the ethical, moral and religious considerations featured throughout the discussions, really in all of the different phases of the public dialogue that we ran. And overall, there was a lot of hope that further research would lead to further improvements in human health through this research. And overall, one of the messages was that many participants would support an extension to the 14-day rule, provided it aligns with society's expectations regarding respect for the embryo, and provided that the research remains rigorously regulated, as it is currently. Concerns raised by the public included worries related to the detection and possible elimination of certain health conditions or disabilities. And there was also a strong interest to involve the public in future decision making. And so reflecting back now into perhaps some of the key aspects that contributed to the project's success, I've listed a few here. So I think one of the factors was that there was a realistic time frame, a realistic budget, and there was good administrative support in place. And these were really key founding blocks for this project. There was also a really experienced and engaged team. It was very diverse across different groups, and this diversity really contributed to a lot of different views and opinions. And it was a very highly interactive set of discussions between these different groups. There was also very effective facilitation and continuity of a small team of delivery partners, and this worked really very well. They ensured that everybody's voices were heard in the public dialogue. They would ensure everything was done in a very sort of sensitive way, and really looked after everybody involved in the discussions. So that was really very effective. Another approach that worked well was there was a good blend of materials. So there was a lot of stimulus material, there was a lot of in-person presentations and discussions, There was a lot of filmed interviews that were very effective, with a real cross-section of people involved in aspects of human embryo research and regulation and ethics. There was also a very good online platform that the participants could access throughout the project, and I think this was really helpful, partly to give the participants a way of asking questions in between the different in-person events. It also allowed them to just take a bit of time to reflect and to think in between all these sort of very busy different workshops that we held, etc. We spent a lot of time thinking about whether we should have the events in person or online, and in the end we opted for a hybrid approach. And I think actually looking back, this hybrid approach was really very useful. There are pros and cons to in-person versus online events, and I think having a combination of the two worked very well for our project. And I would say another key aspect of this was that the amount and the pacing of communications was very important. That has to be judged very well, and you have to build in some downtime into this too, so allow some time for the public participants to go home, to discuss with their friends and family, to just have a bit of time and to sort of collect their thoughts. And then when they come back to the next workshop, they have they've had some time to think about their views on this. And then another important aspect in our public dialogue was that we deliberately included likely opposers to human embryo research into the discussion. And so I think this really enriched the discussion. It helped the public to see different viewpoints and really sort of improved, I would say, a lot of the discussion and the conversation. So certainly in our case, including the likely opposers, I think it really helped the robustness of the project. And so what were some of the impacts that came out of this public dialogue project? Well, we collected a lot of information, and the researchers reported changing in their views, changing in some of their practices, for example. So many of the institutes involved now have more frequent lay summaries, for example, of research to do with human embryos that's publicly available. One other aspect is there was huge amounts of respectful and impactful sharing of views between participants throughout the dialogue, and this was really interesting to see. This was several of the participants fed back to us that perhaps their views on human embryo research was changed during the course of the public dialogue based on conversations they'd had with other members of the public or what they had heard. And of course, many of the participants said that their views were not changed, but that they had a better understanding of other people's views and maybe why other people might think differently, for example. And so this, I think, was a very valuable part of the project in itself. The outcomes of the public dialogue have also contributed to informed decision making. So the regulator in the UK of human embryo research, for example, have taken on board the findings from this public dialogue. Also, there have been larger scale public dialogues planned for later this year. So they're really taking forward some of the foundational steps that we took in this public dialogue and building on that. And I think that's really excellent, because then these larger scale projects can reach more communities and groups and seek views from a wider cross section of society across the UK. So I think that's going to be really important. And there's been also some other follow-on public dialogues on other aspects of science to do with human developmental biology, in particular on so-called embryo models. And the information gleaned from the public dialogue work on this has helped inform new guidelines for researchers working with embryo models, for example. Okay, so if you'd like to find out more information about HDBI or about the public engagement program and the public dialogue project, then I provide the web link here to the website. You can find the public engagement section up in the top right hand corner of the web page when you're there. So that leaves me really just to thank the wonderful public engagement teams that I work with, firstly at the Babraham Institute with Mike, Sasha and Susan, and also at the HDBI Public Engagement Programme with Emma and Naomi. And of course, we're extremely grateful to all of the participants and specialists who took part in the public dialogue that I talked about today, as well as the funders that allowed us to do this work. So I'll stop there and thank you very much.
And it just leads me to conclude proceedings for today. So a complete deck of today's slides will be shared with you by the end of the week. A recording of the webinar will also be on our Public Partnerships YouTube channel within the next 2 weeks for reference or further sharing with colleagues who might be interested. You'll also find there recordings of our previous webinars and case studies of MRC work in this space. We have plans to run another webinar, before the end of the year. So if you have ideas for public partnership in research topics or projects to cover, please share this with us, as we're really keen to respond to your interests. You can share your ideas through the very short evaluation form that we have created here. Other than that, thank you to all of the speakers for sharing their insights today. Thank you to all of you for joining in and questioning, and I hope you found it useful. And thank you to the Public Partnerships team, in particular Heather and Karen, who have worked their magic behind the scenes to make today happen. Please do keep in touch. We have more activities planned for later in the year, some online, some face-to-face, some in London, some in other regions of the UK. So I hope to see you all again soon. Thanks and goodbye.